Hi everyone, and thank you for being today here with Huyen and me. In the end, she could make it. I told you that she was having some issues with her network connection, but in the end, we could have. Um, sorry, one question. 1 second, I'm listening to myself, and this is very. And so, as you can see, she could make it in the end, and we are having her here to ask her a few questions about herself, about her career, and also she will talk us about some new features of the constraint layout and also the motion layout. So I'm really happy to have you here. Thank you so much for being this time with us.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Antonio. Thank you so much.
So, if you want, first, for the ones that don't know much about you, tell us a little about you, what you're doing right now, and all that.
Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Huyen. I'm an Android developer. I'm based in the US in Colorado, and currently I'm working on the Trello app, the Trello Android app for Atlassian. So, and I've been there
That's
about 3.5 years now. So,
yeah. For me, you have been all your life working there, but because I don't know if I met you before that, and it's a great app that I'm sure that many of the listeners use in their day to day. So it's great. It's an exciting project, I guess, working remotely and what. But
yeah.
we'll get to that point later. So if you want, tell us a little about your story first, where you are from, how was your childhood, or what led you to start in software development. A little bit about your background.
Yeah. So I was born in the US, and it was really funny because I got into software development kind of by accident. I was in high school, and we had to have technical requirements. I think back then I wanted to be a journalist. I'm not sure, or maybe a doctor. I kind of went between the two. It's quite different. But in my high school, we had to have technical requirements, and there wasn't a lot of classes. And the first one I took, which is a typing class, because it was easy, and I figured, well, I should get. I love the. I think not sure when this was, and I don't know, so want to say exactly when it was, but I was getting into like the internet and like just doing different things on the web, and I was like, well, if I can type faster, I can probably use the internet faster. So I took a typing class, and unfortunately, I still needed one more credit, and I just happened to find out that some of my friends were taking a programming class, C++, and I pretty much was desperate. I took it out of, hey, why not? My friends are taking it. I'll have help, and I'll know people. But when I took the class, I kind of basically changed my life. I figured that, oh, I love this. This is exactly what I want to do. So I basically changed around to being a computer engineer. Also, I love video games. So I figured, hey, well, I love video games as well. So maybe if I learn how to program and make that my career, maybe I can develop video games as well. I didn't end up doing that. I took a lot of turns in my life. I did web like rich internet applications in college. I got a job doing that at uni. And then I kind of just stuck with web applications. And then I was in the Flash world way back in the day when Flash was still a thing that people actually wanted on their machines. I actually was working on this. It was like a framework built on top of Flash called Flex. And I was doing that for a while. It's actually when I first started speaking. This is, oh gosh, like 10 years ago. And if anyone remembers back then, Steve Jobs, when he was still with us, wasn't really a big fan of Flash and started letting people know how much he didn't like Flash. And it kind of seemed like the world was moving away from that to HTML5 and things like that. And so I had to make a choice. I had to change my technology. Lucky for me, one of my friends at the time, who was also a Flex developer, was really into this thing called Android. And he convinced me to basically learn Android and hop on a job with him, because at the time I was working for a consulting agency, so I was just hopping from project to project. And then I was really lucky. I found out that I loved Android and I loved mobile. Um, and yeah, and that's how I got to Android. It was a little bit tough back then. This was like 7 years ago. There's a lot of weren't a lot of Android jobs, so I did iOS for a while because there are a few more iOS jobs, but it was still mobile. It was still great, and um, I think while I was still with that consulting company, I switched from Android to iOS and maybe back and forth a couple times. And the last switch off I did was Android. and that was kind of just it. I decided to stay because I just started loving to get involved in the community and meeting all these people and really getting into Android, and it kind of just stuck. And I've been there ever since. And that was like my last job before Trello. And so I've been at Trello ever since. But and also, fun fact, that friend of mine who got me into Android is now my fiance. So we're a very boring couple. We just talk mostly about Android. But yeah, so I for many different reasons, Android is a big part of my life. But I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, I can imagine. And how was your progression to get into Trello? What do you think that it helped you the most to get that opportunity?
Networking actually. It's really funny. I can think of the exact moment where I actually got started to get the job. I was actually very lucky to get to IO for the first time, and it was really just talking to people and just kind of opening up and meeting people and asking what they do and having them ask what I do. And I met uh, uh, Hamid. He is currently, I think, kind of he's more of a product guy now, but at the time he was like the mobile lead, and I just got to know him. He thought I'd be good for the team, and the rest is history. So I mean, I strongly believe that a lot of it was kind of getting out there, and not necessarily as a speaker or as doing anything like particular, but just getting out there and meeting people and engaging with people that are interested in what you do or are in the same field as you, and just making connections. I mean, I think that's something you hear a lot is networking, but I mean, literally just going to talk to people. And a lot of that I think was that. Obviously, your experiences and trying to, you know, like keep your skills up and get a broad range of experience is super important. But really, like the doors open when you meet people and you share your experiences with them. So for sure,
Yeah,
that
that's
was
great.
definitely it. Yeah.
Like going to meetups or different events. I think that helps a lot and also gives you a better idea of how the Android world is right
Yeah.
now and what the opportunities are and where
Yeah.
what you can do to achieve those goals. I think
Yeah.
it's great too.
Yeah, and I just wanna make it clear, like, I don't think I said anything, like, crazy, genius, or dazzling about Android. I think I just literally was complaining about things at work, things that I didn't like and the things that I wanted to see changed, and I guess I complained, well enough that that made me s like, I mean, it's just I was speaking very honestly about my experiences and things. So, yeah, I mean, just having that connection and having those experiences to draw from, I think are really, like, really important things. So you never have to worry too much about feeling like you're like a star or that you know everything. It's really just people
Yeah,
appreciate you and who you are and your experiences for sure. So
that's true. And at that moment, were you already doing talks or the interviews or whatever, all
yeah.
these things?
Yeah. So it's funny actually that IO was when so I had already been speaking. So I started speaking about 10 years prior when I was still doing Flex.
Mm.
And so I had stopped a bit, when I was going through all these tech and job changes. I stopped for a bit. But I always love speaking. Um, I think I got to where I am. My first job out of uni was, I mean, it was good, but it was very corporate. It was very, I felt very isolated from other engineers. It was a good job, but I don't, I wasn't as, I wasn't able to, I guess, explore the things I really loved in the same way. And
Mm.
I think that I would have probably stayed in that job if I hadn't have been lucky to go to a conference and to have well, now a friend, but someone that I was working with, go around and like say and introduce me to people and say, hey, you should go talk to these people, or hey, we should go like here and like meet these people, and learning how those connections work. And I really think that that was very valuable for me to kind of open up and say, "Hey, like, oh, this is a community. Like, there's people out there that talk about these things that we love to do." It wasn't just that I go to work, I do my job, and I go home. If I love and I'm passionate about what I'm doing, there's people that can share in that passion. So I was speaking back then because I wanted to kind of really dive into it and also give back because I felt like that really changed my life a lot, having those experiences. So I was speaking a little bit. I was getting back into speaking. I think by the time that IO had come around, I'd done a couple of talks. Those were like my first Android talks. It was really nerve wracking to get back into it, um, and Android just felt very intimidating at the time. It was new for me. Like there's Android's always got its little things. So at the time I got the Trello job, yeah, I was starting to speak again. And it was funny because at IO, Shuki and I had like already kind of planned to do the channel, my YouTube partner Chiki-chan, and we had actually
Mm.
were going around and interviewing people. We just hadn't like published yet. We were kind of just doing the initial interviews. So um it was kind of like Android Dialogs and Trello all kind of happened for me in the same year. I think that was 2015. So it was a really good year for me. I got a new job that I love, with a team I love, with a product I love, and just got to start this YouTube thing that I also love. So with Android. So
Yeah,
yeah, it was a big year.
a great year.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah, that's nice. And I wanted to ask you, dive a little more in all these things you do. What if you have had to fight many fears to do it? I know that people think that people that are used to do talks probably lose those fears, and it's easier for them. Obviously, the experience is it's a point, but can you tell us how it was back then in the first talks, and how it is now when you have to put in front of a lot of people to talk and all that?
Yeah, no, oh my gosh. Imposter syndrome is something I have a lot. I still have it like every other day now, maybe every day. And um I mean, I want to say it's something reassuring, like it goes away, but I think I guess it depends on who you are. For me, it never quite goes away. And I was really intimidated back then. I think um, I'm still always really nervous whenever I'm giving a talk. It doesn't matter if like it's a small room or a big room, or if I've given a talk 5 times before, or once before, or never. I'm always really nervous, and I think um, it's hard not to be nervous. Like you care, you want to do a good job. You want to, be worth. For me, I want to be worth people's time, and so that always makes me nervous. And of course, like it's so hard. For me, I always worry: Am I being technical enough? Did I say something wrong? Did I say something incorrect? Are people going to think I don't know what I'm talking about? That never goes away. But like the more you do it, and like the more that you kind of find your voice, or the more you practice, some of those things go away. You kind of learn your voice, or learn what you like to talk about. You learn how you like to speak. And, hopefully you get feedback where people saying, hey, they learned something, or hey, they appreciated your talk. And that kind of comforts you a little bit. And you kind of feed off that. And you take those first little like bits of like positivity, and kind of like feeling that what you did was worthwhile, and you kind of build on that and build on that. And you kind of use that as a shield. I know for me, I don't think the imposter syndrome and the fears will ever go away, but as long as people like seem like they're getting use out of something that I do, I'll continue to do it. And like Android Dialogs was the same way. I think it's pretty easy to see like the first few episodes or few interviews. I was very nervous. I was very lucky. Chuki Chan knows everyone. And so that was really helpful to get us started. She was able to get us kind of convince all these people to come on camera. And she's awesome, obviously very awesome. She's very outgoing. She's very a great speaker, and just very out there. And for me, I think I wanted to be like that. And I think sometimes I can be like that, but I was also very nervous. Like I think our second episode we released was with Chet Haas and Tor Norby. And I think if you watch that interview, I barely talked at all. I was so nervous. Um, and Trugi tried really hard to help me with that, but it was really difficult. They were also very kind, but um, and I think as I've continued to do this, I've gotten better. You just, can you kind of just again, you learn your voice, you practice, just like everything else. So you just do it again. You make mistakes, you reiterate, you fix your bugs, and you go back again. It's the same with speaking and interviewing, or just doing technical things as it is with anything else. And um, yeah, I don't think it'll ever go away. I still kind of try to do the best I can. I still try to make it worth anyone's time that spends time with me, either with talking to me or listening to me speak. So, um, but just I think definitely celebrating the things that you do well, and appreciating that in yourself is really important. And being easy on yourself. Like definitely work hard, but it's easy for us to be our worst critics. It's easy for us to see the things we did wrong and think of them as about 1,000 times bigger than they are. But celebrating, like knowing what you should do better, but also kind of not being too hard on yourself helps a lot. It's much harder to it's easier to say than to do. Um, and also
Yeah.
like talking to other people, getting support is very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. In my own experience, what I think is that you learn to uh, you learn to not worry about the things that can go wrong. Even if they go wrong, maybe you realize that nothing happens, that people are not there to judge you, just to learn from you. So that really helps a lot. And in my case, it's always the same. I also get very nervous. I'm nervous right now. I am when I do talks, because I'm really shy. But you learn to canalize those feelings, and to make them not uh, to interrupt you, or to make you go away from what you want to tell. And that's the thing. The practice makes it all. Feelings don't go away, but at least you can learn to live with them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's just like a muscle that you exercise. Just the same thing. I totally 120% agree.
And you mentioned a couple of times Android Dialogs.
Yeah.
For the ones that you don't know about it, I probably nobody, but anyway, tell us a little about this and how the idea came up.
Yeah, yeah, sorry. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with, I guess, the channel, my very good friend Chicky Chan and I, we produce a YouTube channel. It's called Android Dialogs, and our tagline is that we have bite-sized conversations with people in the Android community, and really, that's all that is. We meet with people in the Android community, and we talk about what they're doing. So we've talked to developers, of course, designers, managers, and really, if it's related to Android development, even if it's kind of more career related or like design related, we talk about everything. Um, and so we've been doing this since I think we first published a video September 2015. That was like my big year, and we've been doing it ever since. We try to be weekly. We're not always. It's difficult when you have a proper job and doing your side things. Of course, I'm sure Antonio, you probably know. Like, there's a lot. There's always a lot going on. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's been really great. I think when I started to get back into the Android community, I think Kaushik Gopal and Don Felker were working on Fragmented. I think they had just started it that year. I might be incorrect on that. And um, I've always loved the idea of podcasts and YouTube and the internet media. It feels like these days, if you have something to say, there's so many platforms for you to, put your voice out there and easily, just like for us normal people, not just like,
Yeah.
people in the industry. And um, I always wanted to do something like that. I always wanted to have a podcast. But I also have a very short attention span. I have difficulty paying attention longer than 40 minutes. That's just me. I just, it's just a failing of mine. And so I kind of wanted to do something almost for me where I wanted to talk to people in the Android community, but also keep it relatively short. But just be able to kind of talk to people. And I strongly feel again that I would not be who I am in my career and like as like skilled or as happy or as like kind of where I am without other people in the community putting themselves out there and sharing. And I think that a lot of times, every community I think has very visible people that
Mhm.
do a lot, are kind of famous, that you kind of everyone knows. But there's so many people doing wonderful things that you may not know as well, just because I don't know, maybe you're not in the same geographic location or you just haven't been exposed to them. And so I love the idea of just celebrating everyone and anyone and everyone that does something wonderful or interesting or cool in this community. So I brought the idea to Chiki Chan because we both were going to IO. I was so excited, and I was like, "What do you think if I did this podcast thing?" And she said, "Well, I have a camera. I'm gonna do video." So we ended up just kind of working on it together, and that's kind of just history. We've been doing it ever since. Usually we'll go to conferences and talk to speakers, but other times we'll just talk to folks that have something cool to share. So yeah, and that's Android Dialogues.
Yeah, what I find fascinating is that you do it live and in any events. How do you prepare all that? Do you go with the studio on your luggage, or
Yeah.
how that
Um,
works?
it was funny because it just started out with Chuki's camcorder, and I had a small audio recorder. And then I guess like anything else, you just something breaks and you try to fix it. So with us, like we had a lot of echo or reverb like the first time, so we're like, okay, I'm gonna get a better mic setup. Um, and it's just kind of like any other hobby or something. You start just building and building, and now I have like several kilos of equipment that I'm bringing with me everywhere. I have like a camera. I'm kind of the crazy one. Chuki has is less crazy than me. I have a setup with lights and like with a camera and with microphones and all kinds of stuff. I'm very lucky that my fiance, who's also again like I said an Android developer, tends to come with me to conferences. But generally the way it works is that I'll try to find folks to talk to. The easiest thing to do is to look at the speakers list and see, who's talking, who's going to be there. It's a good way to find like just guests, and a lot of times it's also I think easiest from the guests just because they're kind of prepped and ready to talk about something. But we try to find. We try to find really hard not to talk to the same people twice. I don't think we've really talked to anyone of the same guest twice, although we did have Eugenio Morletti on twice, one for doing paper and one to talk about. But we try to find new people all the time because again,
Mm.
my goal is to like kind of celebrate all the different people we have in the community. So I try really hard to find different people. So I usually go look at the speaker list, or if there's someone I know that I kind of know of that they've done something cool, I'll just ask them if I know they're going to be at the conference or if I know I'm going to be in their area, and then I usually just bug a bunch of people, see who's willing to talk to me for, 20 minutes, and then I just set up somewhere hopefully convenient, and then um hopefully come stop by and just chat with me for a bit. And yeah, it's a bit of work setting up and bringing the equipment. I've gotten pretty strong the last couple years hauling things around, but it's really fun, and I just really enjoy it, and I hope it's not too much. Honestly, I hope it's not too painful for the people that do it, which I really appreciate everyone who's ever been on. But yeah, that's pretty much how it goes. I just kind of bug people to talk to me and then put them on camera.
That's awesome. I I really appreciate all that work because I try to record my videos too, and it's pretty difficult. And seeing you do it out of your comfort zone in any place and prepare all the equipment and all that, that's really amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough sometimes. Places aren't always perfect. Like you'd love to have a wonderful soundproof studio that's well lit. Sometimes things are a little bit echoey. Sometimes the camera's a little bit off. Sometimes I have something in my teeth that actually has happened. Where I look at the videos like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have had lunch before I talked to that person. But yeah, I mean, I think people are actually just really genuinely happy to see our interviews, I think, for the most part, and not
Mm,
worried about what I have in my teeth. So it's a challenge, but it's still fun, I think, and our audience is in general fantastic. So
awesome. And apart from all those contributions to the community you do in many different ways, what other hobbies that can be a little away from development do you have? I read something about games, video games
yeah.
in general, but also table games, I think, and all that.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can tell us a little.
I've always been a big gamer. My parents got us a NES when we were little, and I've loved video games since then. Again, like, and I mentioned it kind of drove my passion to be an engineer. That kind of dropped off. I know that the games industry is pretty tough, and I think that I'll say I chickened out, but I decided that I kind of didn't want to go in that direction. I still love video games. I think they're amazing, and it's kind of a good time to be uh someone into video games. It feels like I don't know, they're a little more mainstream than they used to, but I like all kinds of games. I love board games. A lot of my family and my friends are board game people. I love card games. My dad kind of that was kind of one of our things, just to sit around. I remember when we were little, where I lived, usually we'd have thunderstorms in the summer and the lights would often go out, and I would actually love for the lights to go out because then my dad would just sit around and play card games with us. Games was kind of like just one of those things that we like to do together. Um yeah, mostly games. I also let me think. The audio video has also become kind of a hobby. I mean, that's kind of cheating because it's still Android related, but I really think that audio video production is really fascinating. And just like anything else tech related, there's like so many levels that you can get involved in and
Yeah.
research, and there's so many aspects to it. It's really neat. I'm not any good at it. I'm not saying I'm any good at it, but it's fun, and it's fun to do. Especially again like with YouTube and with the internet and seeing what people can do like with like few resources, and the kind of beautiful amazing videos and documentaries and like kind of essays that people put out out for other people to enjoy. I like doing whatever I can to palely imitate that, but that's pretty cool. Um, and yeah, like I guess when I'm not doing any of that, I love to cook as well. My fiance and I both love to eat, and I tend to cook a lot when I can when I'm not editing videos or working. I really do love. cooking, and it's another thing that I've also kind of gotten to like deep holes. And I feel like everything I do, it's going to turn into like gadgets or like figuring out like the optimal technique and like debugging and iterating and or like everything else. So yeah, if you follow me on Twitter at Queen Code Monkey, and I apologize, but every now and again when I make something that isn't half bad, I like to post it. So if you follow me and you notice food, that's because I've kind of been really into
Yeah,
cooking
but it's
the last
nice
couple
too
of
to
years.
see what people do in their free time, what the other people you may follow for other different things, because in the end, it's we are a whole person, and even if we try to compartmentalize our lives, in the end, we are a whole person, and everything mixes. And yeah, I think that seeing the hobbies of other people make you understand better how they think and uh, what they do, and that's that's nice. I love seeing your photos about cooking too, because
Oh, thank you.
I
I
it may
do
be
I
because
do.
I like cooking too,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
like watching your what you get from there. But yeah, it's
Oh.
another nice hobby, and that
Yeah, I mean, and we all need food, right? So,
yeah.
I'm just trying to be ready for when the zombies come and we all have to start cooking our own food and can't go to McDonald's or something. I just want to be ready for just a few basic skills. But yeah, I do agree. I think that um especially as engineers, I feel like it's so easy to get wrapped up into work, especially with some of the pressures of the tech industry. I
Yeah.
do think that yeah, you should um nurture like the whole you and explore things and put your passion in other things as well. And like you said, whole people like and yeah, and letting that side of yourself show is it's gratifying. And I again, like it's likewise, I like seeing it in other people too. um, so
Nice. Yeah, I totally agree that we need to disconnect a little bit from our world, because otherwise we can get consumed.
mhm.
I I had some years a few years ago that I only did Android and couldn't get away from that, and that's also not very good. So having some hobbies that can you get distracted and and focus on other things, I think it's very good too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I strongly think that's important. I mean, it is. I think there's a lot of pressure, especially when you're younger and kind of beginning in your career. There's a lot of pressure to just
Mm.
kind of work that 60-hour week and get things done and build a career. But I think that it's easy to burn out or lose your passion when it because it can become a grind. We'll have to ship, 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 ship. Um, and yeah, I think as I've grown older, like you can balance out having a very full, like dedicated, passionate career, but still like be yourself. And I think the being yourself and having something outside of work, it becomes more important, especially if you want to stay in here and you want to stay enthusiastic. You have to, like you said,
Yeah.
disconnect. It's so important.
Mhm.
And take care of yourself. I've actually also really been into like exercising and taking care of myself like the last few years. And it seems selfish, it seems kind of silly, but there's taking care of yourself kind of makes taking care of good food, good exercise, getting away from the desk. I think it does make for a better career overall and a longer career for sure.
Yeah,
So
agreed. Totally. And getting back to the end of this first part, when you think
mhm.
about your long-term future, how do you see it? Do you think that you continue doing software development all your life? Have you thought about it? Because nowadays it's difficult.
Yeah, it's hard. I honestly believe that for better for worse, that I don't think Android will look what it will look like in 5-10 years. I do continue want to be an engineer and do software, whatever that means, in 10-15 years. Um, I know a lot of us kind of have that question of do we want to stay an engineer or do we want to go into management? And to be honest with you, I love leading teams and I love leading features. I don't think I like as I see it now, I don't think I could ever get too much away from being hands-on with engineering. So
Mm.
I kind of see myself still software development, maybe leading a team, but still kind of hands-on and doing cool things. That's kind of it's still like my passion. And I think that if I'm not doing mobile, that's okay. I would like to stay in it as long as it's like a thing. But I mean, who knows what kind of interfaces or what kind of devices we'll have in 5-10 years. Maybe it'll be like Minority Report and we'll start like, mobile development won't even be like how
Yeah.
we picture it. But I'd like to be in it. I love the tech space. I love seeing what tech is enabling us to do and how it's changing the world. I still believe mostly for the better, sometimes not so better, but I think being in it and trying to make a good impact as things change and as technology allows us to do more things is kind of just where I want to be. So yeah, I think I'll still be in tech. Hopefully programming until they've automated all the programming as well. And I guess when that comes along, I'll have
And
to
we lose
figure
our
something
jobs.
else out. Yeah, we'll see. But
Yeah, anything can happen. So, so you have to recommend just one thing to our listener about anything IT related or not. What would be?
oh my gosh, it's so hard. I guess just in general, I would just try to. I don't think I could recommend one specific thing, but um, I would say like just keep trying to see what other people are doing. Be inspired. I think that it's hard to keep up. Like I know, like after every conference, there's like 20 talks, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to go watch 20 talks and take notes. I wouldn't even like go that far. I think just and again, we talked about work-life balance and trying not to inundate yourself with work
Yeah.
things, but try to stay, kind of have a vague idea what people are doing. Like watch talks, but don't worry about consuming and remembering everything. Um, kind of see what other people are doing, see what people that you respect or that you think are cool are doing, and just stay inspired. Like keep consuming more things. I think that the thing that I've learned most about this career is that you're not going to be doing the same thing for 5, 10 years in a row. And it's hard sometimes because, we all have all those like frustrations with like something not working or learning a new thing and things changing. And it's intimidating and frightening. But that's just kind of how being an engineer is. And that part of being okay with that is just continuing to learn, like, enjoy learning, enjoy things being disrupted, and try to stick with it. You're not gonna keep up with everything, that's impossible, but just be open to things, new ideas, see what other people are doing, and be open to them. I think, yeah, be open, yeah, just be open and just, like, watch, read, everything, as much as you can, but still take time for non-tech stuff. So, I guess it's my kind of very general thing that I
No,
would
but
hope people do.
yeah, that's a great recommendation. Awesome. And as you know, I ask questions to ask everyone to be able to ask questions to you
Mhm,
from the social networks
mhm,
and also through email. And I got
mhm.
one question for you, one extra
Yeah,
question that is from Lazy Kotliner from Twitter.
mhm.
He asked me to ask her how you learned. What is your learning process for new things? Your routine? What do you do? For instance, when you had to investigate what you are talking about today, what's
Yeah.
your process to
To
learn it?
learn new things. Oh, that's a great question. Because I just mentioned that it's really important to learn new things. You kind of have to have a lot of strategies. The best case scenario is that you're doing a new thing at work and you get to use some new API. Like that's the dream, right? That hey, I have a new feature to write and I get to use MotionLayout for it. That doesn't always happen. So you kind of have to have different strategies. I think the most important thing is well, I'm gonna say force yourself to learn is a little bit strong, but I think that, holding yourself accountable to learning it is a good strategy. Set yourself a deadline, set yourself a goal, and have something come out of that. So, something I've done, like, and this is like this is totally, I think, a totally fair strategy is to say, okay, I want to learn this thing, and in order to make myself learn it, I will commit to giving an introductory talk about it at a meetup in 2 months. And I say that, and I caution people not to just read the documentation and go just and read documentation to people. But having a goal where you can say, okay, I'm going to learn how to do this thing. I'm going to learn the things that are hard that the documentation might not cover, or if a new release came out, I'm going to focus on the new things and I'm going to tell people about it. And I think that's like it's like personal accountability. I think my friend Christina Lee called it like that. Accountability is that you have to kind of, it's just like school, right? Would you learn? It's just sometimes like at school, like I don't think I would have studied certain chapters if I didn't have to have a test on it. So you kind of have to test your knowledge. If that can't be at work, then do it for a meetup. but like at work, any opportunity you can, I would try to push for new things, and especially in mobile, you have to do that. I think, obviously, like the ability for you to do that will vary based on what your product is. Like, obviously, if you're with a big company that handles personal information, financial information, there's amount of risk that there's only so much risk you can take. But at the
Yeah.
same time, part of your job as an engineer is learning how to gauge risk and learning, how to say, okay, I think it's safe for us to try this new thing here, and providing yourself and your team the opportunities to learn that. Because, um, I mean, there's a risk in keeping old technology anyway. So I think that something that is also a good strategy to do is just to learn when when a new thing will benefit you and when you can start integrating it at work. And that's also kind of a way that we learn new things.
Hmm.
One of my teammates, Vishnu Rajivan, is really good at this. He keeps up with the new things, and when he sees a situation where it's low risk, it's like kind of isolated, and we would benefit from it. He just says, "Hey, why don't we try this new thing?" And of course, we discuss it and decide, "Hey, should we use this new thing?" But I think keeping that question of, "Hey, is this going to be is can we benefit from this and can we try this?" Well, let's keep that at the front of your mind, I think. And that way you create, again, situations for yourself to learn new things and for other people to learn new things. And I think that's just as important. And I've said things like have a side project. Like if you're like many of us and you have a side project or a dream app, that's obviously a
Mhm.
great place to learn new things. Again,
Yeah.
none of us all have time for it, but um, yeah, like finding opportunities at work, just trying new things, try to give a talk about it, challenge yourself. Those are all kind of like my different strategies for learning different things. It depends on what it is, of course, but it's a good toolbox for trying to sneaking in learning new things, I think.
Yeah, personally, the way that I found that it helps me learn something, but in the deepest way is to teach it, because when you teach something, people will ask questions that you haven't done to yourself before, and that helps you keep growing on that matter. Because even if you use it on your own apps, or probably people that are around you are learning with you and using the same techniques that you are using, but
Yeah,
somebody from the outside suddenly thinks about something that you hadn't thought before, that you gave for granted, and that
yeah.
makes you realize that you didn't understand it completely. And
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's the intimidating part of like doing this kind of teaching people, but it also can be very rewarding. Like you said, like people will have a perspective or think of something that you didn't think of. And it's easy to be, I'm scared of that all the time. Like, oh, someone asked me a question I don't know. That's okay. Like that is totally fine. Again, easier to say than to feel, but I think that's a great
yeah,
point. And that, I mean, everybody's learning. So there's probably something that you just said that someone else didn't know. So just kind of it's a given back and forth, and yeah, it's very rewarding and definitely uh it definitely pushes you. I think when you learn
yeah,
something, I think that's totally on point.
yeah. It's also a great thing also that even when you are giving to people, you will receive that in
Absolutely,
exchange, and
totally.
and you learn the topic much more deeply than if you didn't do it. So
Yes,
another
absolutely,
thing to encourage people sharing their knowledge, that you will
exactly.
learn a lot in the process.
Yes, yes. So it's a little bit selfish, but also it's like altruistic and selfish at the same time. So it's all
It's
kinds
a
of
win-win.
perks. Exactly, all kinds of perks for you. So
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much for this part of the interview. And now, when you're ready, we can start with the talk.
okay, great. Let me just get a couple of notes up. So yes, like I mentioned, so this is something that I've kind of forced myself to learn. It's like a brand new thing, and
Mhm.
I guess for just to let folks know, I think one of my favorite things about being a mobile developer is UI. I've always been kind of attracted to UI. I think the idea of working on things that people interact with and that kind of can be delightful or helpful is kind of what gets me out of bed in the morning and kind of what um, can you see my screen? It's probably
Yeah,
hard to see yourself. Is
I
what
see
kind of gets
myself.
me is what gets me out of bed in the morning. So I absolutely love UI things. And so one of the things that I've been most excited about the last couple of years is Constraint Layout. I'm trying to find the right is Constraint Layout, which hopefully folks have been a little bit familiar with, but I guess you can kind of think of it as, can I hide this? There we go. For those of you who maybe have not tried Constraint Layout yet, it's just basically this brand new layout that allows you to position and size things relative to each other, but in a more efficient way. And I think a more uh, high level and more kind of like organized way than we had before with, say, like relative layout and things like that. And so I've done a few talks on constraint layout. I think there's a lot of amazing features on it. This particular talk is called Cool Constraint Layout, but it's 2.0. First, because it's kind of a second version of this talk. I'm not going to talk about the basics of constraint layout, but it's also 2.0 because we're going to talk about constraint layout 2.0. And I think it's really interesting because last year around April, Constraint Layout 1.1 was announced, and then about 2 seconds later, they released 1.1, and then about 2 seconds later, they announced 2.0. And there's a lot of really cool things about Constraint Layout. And I'm going to say I'm a huge fan of the two gentlemen that work on Constraint Layout, John Hofford and Nicolas Rorard on the Android team. And I have to say, like, just as an engineer, they put so much thought and also they listen so much to what we need. And I think that if you've used Constraint Layout 1, but you haven't gotten to Constraint Layout like 1.1 and 2.0, I I hope that you kind of share my feeling that they've kind of taken in a lot of feedback, like listened to the use cases that people are presenting and tried to build on top of what they already have to make layout easier. And I think that overall, like layout in Android can be messy, especially if you've been doing Android for a while. At some point, someone's going to ask you to do something weird. Hopefully they ask you to do something out of the box, just like, use, like the nice material components that we have now or things out of the box and just call it a day. But very often you have to do very specialized things and animate something or write a custom view and things like that. I think that, like other things that Google has been introducing, they're trying to raise the level, right? So like, material and like, like the support library and like Jetpack. I feel like Google is trying to give us all these tools to kind of give us a better baseline, right? So we have to do less custom work, less kind of fiddling, and kind of concentrate more on building beautiful UI and UX. And I really strongly feel that there's a lot of really great ideas in constraint layout that kind of contribute to that. So anyway, I'm not going to go into constraint layout too much, but basically the idea is that you define constraints, basically relationships between views to size and position things. And that's pretty much how constraint layout 1 worked. And in constraint layout 2, there's kind of like a lot of features that I think that are really good answers to common problems that we have. So to kind of demonstrate this, I wrote a little app with kind of using different features. So if you can see my emulator, I've got a couple things going, but I'm actually going to go back to here for a second. So this is something that I know I run into, and it's kind of like tricky positioning. And I think that a problem I know I run into when I'm developing a new screen is that you get designs and they're beautiful. Everything is kind of looking lovely. Everything is kind of proportioned well. And then you go and sit down and you start putting in real data and things don't behave the way you want them to. So generally in constraint layout, you kind of position and size things in a relative layout like way, right? You say to the start of this, to the left of this, to match this thing, to wrap its content. Um, and those are pretty, I think, concrete, right? You can kind of very easily see the connection between the view that you're positioning and sizing and the view that you're kind of doing the positioning and sizing relative to. But there's a lot of really wonderful features in constraint layout that are more, we'll call them virtual helpers, where so technically they're views, but really they're things that aren't rendered to the screen, but that just help you describe relationships in a better way. And barriers are one of those things. So if we look at this example, so this kind of happens, we do this a lot in Android, right? We have an image, we have some text, and we want to kind of position them like with relationships to each other. So right now, I have an image, and that image is aligned. Its start edge is aligned to be, what did I actually align to? Is aligned to the end of this title. So as my title like changes, so if I change the actual content in this title, the image will actually change to align with the end of it, which is fine-ish. But as you can see, it becomes really dependent on the data that I have in here. And if you see here, I have a long title, but a very long subtitle, then I've coming into this like, clipping issue. And I mean, I guess the really naive thing you could do is like, well, okay, descriptions are kind of long. Maybe I'll just go ahead and instead of positioning this to the title, I'll just position it next to the description. Cool. That works until obviously you get some other data
It can happen the other way around.
it just happens the other way around. So obviously, I mean, and I've run into this exact issue. And before there was no good way to figure out, okay, what do I do? Now there's barriers. So barriers are virtual guidelines. So if you've used Constraint Layout a bit, you know that there are these kind of like helpers called guidelines, which look very much like if you look at like material design guidelines, and you see like key lines, the idea of like you want to align content along lines. There are these kind of like views that basically act as guidelines. So they form horizontal and vertical kind of points that you can anchor views to. Now, barrier is very similar to that, but rather than say being a specific, percent across the parent or a specific XY coordinate, barriers basically allow you to define a kind of a guideline, but based on which view in a group of views is furthest along in one direction. So the easiest way to kind of show that is if I say create a barrier. And again, a barrier, like under the hood, is a view, but it's a view that doesn't get rendered and is a view just there for positioning. So you won't ever see it. So I've got this like barrier tag. I'm going to give it an ID. ID. And like width and height don't really do anything. I just kind of put wrap content in there just to fill it out. And so that Lint wouldn't yell at me. And then you specify a direction. So here I'm going to specify end. And basically, the direction of the barrier is basically the side at which Constraint Layout will look at and see which view is basically positioned furthest out in that direction. So I'm going to specify some views that I want the Constraint Layout to look at. So I'm going to do, let's see, image title. Oops. Image. And this is the tricky part with some of these tags is that when you have these like kind of groups, these comma separated list of view IDs, number one, don't put the @ ID in them. And number two, I don't think we're getting autocomplete yet. So you have to be careful. But as you can see here in the preview, it's already created this barrier. So this blue dotted line is the barrier. And so that's my virtual helper, my virtual guideline. And it will actually, again, try to figure out which view is furthest out in the end. So like basically in this position, since we're doing left to right, the furthest view to the right. And as I change, that barrier will reposition itself, based on whichever view that I've specified in this barrier is, furthest right. And what I can do then is rather than positioning my image to be at the end of this image description or image title, I can set it to be aligned to the barrier. And for free, basically, and without me having to worry about, okay, is this title shorter or is the description shorter? I get this nice alignment. And I just love this feature. It's just the idea that, okay, sometimes we have data to deal with. We have data of different lengths. We don't want to hard code things because on Android we have different screen devices, screen sizes, and screen densities. We try not to like hard code things, and this is just another tool to help us with that. And this just feels really, this really feels to me like a feature that someone said, "Hey, I have this problem. How do you solve this?" It really feels like, again, this is one of those answers to the problem. So it's one of my favorite kind of things. And again, you can do it top, left, or top, bottom, start, end. You should always use start, end, not left, right, or left, right, so that we can do RTL and LTR correctly. But yeah, so that's barriers. And again, great tool to use. It's kind of crazy. It's not always apparent when you need them, but when you need them, it's just fantastic. So another kind of thing that you might have heard of is groups. So groups are kind of like another one of these virtual helper things. Under the hood, it's a view, but really it's just a way for you to define relationships between one or more views, and then to be able to toggle the visibility of that group of views. So here I just define a group. So this group lives inside of my constraint layout. And again, with height, it doesn't quite matter. It's a virtual view. It won't get rendered. So but again, I'm going to define a relationship between two or more views. And I do that by providing some IDs. So these are IDs from the views that I had up here. in my barrier example, and they're going to be comma separated. Again, we don't get any autocomplete yet, although if you do type in something that doesn't exist, it will check it at runtime. It's just not helping you with the autocomplete. So that's just to be aware. And then, so if I'm going to pull up, let me actually run this real quick. So, so here in my emulator, I have my barriers example. Now, right now, the visibility of this group that I've created from kind of all these components is set to visible. If I set it to gone and I go ahead and run again and hope that Insta-run actually works, that barrier is gone. I have my next example coming up. So again, it's just a really succinct way of saying, hey, I want all of these to kind of form a unit, like a UI kind of section almost. And I want to toggle their visibility gone, and visible kind of without having to say this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one, like individually setting the visibility on each of them. So that's pretty handy. I know I've written so many functions where I try to like be fancy and like try to make my code drier and say, okay, like pass in like an array of IDs and like set, you don't have to do that
Yeah.
anymore. You can use groups, which is great.
I've been there too.
Oh my gosh, just like it's so nice. Or yeah, I used like butter knife actions and that was great, but being able to do this is so much nicer.
Mm.
And I think what's really nice about doing a constraint layout is that it kind of gives you a high level tag, right? So that a couple of things. You don't have to kind of do some things in code and some things in XML. You get the kind of nice high level um organization of your code, right? You can specify this kind of logical group in the XML, which is really nice. And it's easy to kind of look at the XML and say, okay, I see this is a group and they're all visible or invisible or gone. Um, so I know something that everyone probably runs into at some point is the need to size things based on a percentage of the parent. And I know we have percent layout. Now we have that kind of functionality, but inside of constraint layout itself. So these are percent constraints. And again, it's basically saying, hey, I want to align or size something based on some percentage of the parent. So a lot of times you'll say, okay, I want the margin to be 25% of like my parent or something like that. Here I have a very simple example. I have 3 views. They're just views. They're kind of aligned to each other. And the way that percent constraints work is that you use this 0DP. So just like in linear layout or in kind of other kind of constraint layout features, when you set a dimension to 0DP, it's almost like you turn on like a special mode where you can access kind of very specialized sizing. And that's called match constraint. So basically saying, okay, match whatever constraint that you set with other properties. And here I have my width, right? So I want to size my width of these views by percents. So I set each of them to 0DP, which is match constraint. And then I actually have to give it a constraint to match. And I do that here. So here, each of these get a width, constraint width percent, and I pass it a floating point value between 0 and 1, kind of align everything as usual. And so I have my first purple view taking up 50% and the other 2 taking up, 25%. And if I want to do something silly, like let's just make it like 80% and do 15 or yeah, 15, and then we'll do 5. And I think that adds up to 100.
Yep.
Thanks. And as you can see here, it's pretty simple to, again, use percents and just change just a floating point value to get that nice sizing. So, and that's in Constraint Layout 1.1. And you can use
Nice.
so something really interesting is circular constraints. So I don't know if any of y'all remember back to like say I'm not sure which class it'd be, but like one of those math classes where you learn about polar coordinates. So there's different ways of there's different coordinate systems, right, where you can specify the position of something. Typically, we're very used to x and y, but another way of doing it is with polar coordinates, where you have, say, a circle. You have a radius from the center of that circle and an angle around that circle, and that's just an alternate way of defining where something lives in a plane. Well, we can do that now with constraint layout, and it's basically that's exactly what circular constraints are. They're polar coordinates for views inside of a constraint layout. And I have a really silly example. So I have an Android here, and I have this little pink smartphone, and it's actually circularly constrained to this Android. So how it works is instead of say constraining start and top bottom, kind of the 4 normal edges. You're going to specify another view or another target view helper that you want to constrain your view to. So in here's case, layout constraint circle, I'm specifying it to be icon Android. So I'm telling this smartphone icon that you're going to be centered around, or you're going to be positioned around relative to a circle around the Android. The angle at which you're going to be is 300, and then the radius of your center from your the view that you're kind of aligned positioned relative to is going to be 80 dp. And so here I have, I guess from 12 o'clock is 0, 300 degrees, and then 80 dp. So if I change it, let's put it at, I don't know, 180. So that's 100, and maybe we'll make it like a lot bigger radius. And if I insta run, you can see it should be, let's see, it should be here. There we go. And it's a little bit further. And that's pretty much it. I mean, I know this is like a very specialized kind of um,
Yeah.
measurement, but I asked when I first talked about this, I was like, okay, anyone give me some examples of things that you can do. I know Andrew Kelly gave some examples of like, doing planets and like stars, but you can also do like clocks, of course, as well. I think, I'm not sure the example he gave. Someone mentioned that they worked on kind of like Nest, like a thermostat, so it's like a round interface, and then they had numbers around it. So you can certainly do that as well. Um, and of course, you can circularly constrain things around each other. So if I actually add another smartphone, I can circularly constrain a second one. Oh, let me see. I can constrain things to others. So it's really interesting. Again, this will kind of not circumvent. This will replace any start, end, top, bottom. But it's just a really cool tool in the toolbox, especially if you're working on, I guess, circular interfaces. That's pretty cool. And something in 1.1. All right, finally, placeholders. So placeholders are really neat. It's this idea that, I think one of my favorite things about constraint layout is this idea that oops, let me get rid of, where was it? Let me get rid of that extra smartphone. So I think what constraint layout in general has tried to do is to make transitioning and to make thinking of layouts with different, like kind of like being able for you to define alternative layouts, alternative positioning for things very easily. If you're familiar with constraint set, that's one way to do it. Placeholders is like another way to do it. And I really like placeholders. It's the idea of, again, it's a virtual helper. So it's a view under the hood, but really it's this idea of making a position, a set of layout params like sizing and kind of left, right, top, bottom, making that kind of its own entity within the layout. And rather than you thinking about it as changing maybe the top, left, right, bottom size of a view, you can think about it as swapping a view between two different places, two different like sets of layout params. So just to really actually illustrate what I'm talking about. So again, a placeholder is like a virtual helper. So it's going to be like a view tag in your constraint layout. And you just specify some layout params. Just pretend that you're actually laying that view out. And so you give it start, end, top, bottom, margins. And what we can do is specify this content. So the placeholder is just waiting for a view to be put into it, waiting for a view to be assigned to it. So whenever a view gets assigned to a placeholder, that placeholder does the work of setting the layout params on that view to match the layout params of this placeholder. So what I have here is two placeholders, primary and alt. So those are my two positions. And I actually have some code inside of, where is it? What did I do? Change places. 1 second. Where did I put it? So I have like some code that will actually swap these views. 1 second. Where did I put it? Where did I put that code? Oh, there it is. Haha. So basically what you do is if you want to move a view from one placeholder holder to another, you basically let the placeholder that you want to switch to know that, hey, here is the view ID of the view that is now going to be your content. So what's happening is here, I have a click listener that listens to the click on this button, and it runs this method. And basically it says, okay, if you want to swap, go from whatever placeholder you were to the other one. And you do that by calling set content ID. Now it's really important actually that when you're moving a view from one to the other and you don't want to use that old placeholder anymore, you have to set, you basically have to clear out the content. Otherwise, you're going to be having both placeholders kind of competing to set the layout params in that view. But basically, that's all I'm doing here in this function, just swapping between one placeholder and the other and clearing the other one out. And I get this really nice ability to change the params very succinctly. And again, it's kind of a much more kind of high level way of thinking about positioning the view. It's like, okay, I want it in this spot or in this spot. So if you have content that might be expanding or just might have two different positions based on some parameters, it's a really great way of doing it. And you can make it fancier if you want to add um, like a simple transition. You can do that as well, so that you can go ahead and animate the transition. And what's really neat as well is that you're not just like kind of um, stuck with just swapping kind of views around. You can actually say, let me see, so let me add another placeholder image like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, so this the second image is going to start out as the content of my second placeholder. So my larger placeholder is going to have the second view that I just created, and my first placeholder is going to have the original view. And actually, I have to do a little more changes. So rather than just swapping out and clearing the old placeholder, I'm going to go ahead and exchange them. So I'm going to do something like this. So I have two views now, two different view IDs. And whenever I click that button, I'm actually just going to swap the content, swap the view ID that is set there. And if I actually go ahead and run this, you can see that, oop, what did I do wrong? Let me see this, set content ID. Let's see. Content view there, ID, ID2. That's something wrong. Hold on. Let's see. The content ID all primary. Okay. Okay, I definitely did something wrong.
I cannot see it either.
Oh, really?
So.
Okay. So, live coding is fun. But I promise that you can actually get these two to swap appropriately. Oh, maybe I just need to run it again. But yeah, you can actually, rather than just simply moving one view between two places, is to actually get them to swap. There we go.
Now.
There we go.
That's really
Sometimes you
cool.
just have to rebuild. But again, this is just like a really light way for you to change between kind of two different positions or to move content around very easily within your view. So with that in mind, I think, again, like I mentioned before, one of my favorite things about Constraint Layout is this idea of, I think, making like layout of views less tied into the layout. Less tied into the view hierarchy itself. So in episode, I think 50 of Chet Haas and Tor Norby's podcast, Android Developers Backlash, I think it was 50. They had John and Nicola on, and Nicola said something that I'm never going to forget. And he said that the goal, like the thing that they're driving towards with like these components, is to separate the view hierarchy from the layout hierarchy, which I think is a hard thing for us to understand as Android developers, at least up until now, because it feels like the layout is the view, right? But I think there's this idea of separating out views and kind of like the content and like the relationship between different views in your UI from where they have to be. So like, for example, when I say like layout views, right, I have to have views aware of each other, of who's like left of what and right of what, and like, how things wrap, because I want the view to look, I want the layout to look a certain way. But that might not really have anything to do with like the relationship of one piece of content to the other, of one button to the other. It's just connections I have to make to put things where I want to put them. And I think like some of these features that we're seeing are kind of separating that. So you can have a set of views, a set of relationships between widgets, items in a layout, but then have how they're arranged, how they relate to each other to be a little more fluid, a little more dynamic. And that's something that I think Constraint Layout gives you. And so there's this like concept in Constraint Layout called constraint sets, where a constraint set is literally just a set of constraints. It's a bunch of positions, a bunch of sizes of of all of the views within a layout. And I can use those constraint sets to swap really easily between two different layouts. So I don't have to size everything myself. I don't have to, manually set layout params and do this whole set layout params thing. I just get to say, hey, swap between this set and the other. And that's kind of been one of my favorite things in constraint set. And this is the code that I'm using to kind of do what I'm doing here. I have two separate layout files. Activity, it's a one layout file and another layout file. So it's this alt file and this original file. And all I've done is to basically parse these layout files using constraint layout into two sets. And all I do is just swap between the two of them. I hit a button, I apply one constraint set, or I can apply the other constraint set. I add in some default transitions, and I get this delightful transition. And we've had that for the last couple years from constraint set or constraint layout rather. But just like everything else, things can be better. And I mean, this is really good. I think just kind of just for a good start. But if you keep looking at this and you kind of look at it critically, there's some things that could be better, right? Number one, you can kind of see that at times, I wish I could slow this down, but when I transition, sometimes the text tends to overlap the image. They kind of run together. And also, I don't have a lot of control over this, right? I can only swap between the two. I can't do much with the transition. I can't slow things down. I can't say, hey, can you move this before that? It's a kind of say fire and forget. So what can we do about it? Well, we can use motion layout. So motion layout is a subclass of constraint layout, and it's kind of a lot of things together. So I think what can be very hard about animating things on Android is that we have a lot of animation systems. We have transitions, we have interpolate, we have the animators, like property animators. We have all these different systems, and they're good in different cases, but nothing ever seems quite perfect for everything, right? So you have property animators, and value animators, which allow you really tight control over how things animate, but that aren't that are all done in code. They're very kind of you have to be very specific, and you're basically down again in the nitty gritty of the code doing things, but you get a lot of control. Whereas you have things like scenes and transitions, which are more high level, more declarative, easier to read, probably easier to maintain in a very real way, but that aren't very fine tuned. You can't it's very hard to get sometimes very custom behavior out of these features. So I think what's really interesting about motion layout is that it's kind of like it's a little bit of all these other things are kind of wrapped into one. It's got some of transition manager in it. It's got some value property animate or value property animator in it, and I think it's trying to bridge this gap between very complex, very specific animation, but also transitions and linking, these animations to high level concepts like transitioning from one layout to the other. Um, so I would actually highly recommend that you go to Nicolas' series. He's got a whole Medium series called Introduction to Motion Layout, and he lays out this whole kind of theory and everything about motion layout. But there's something that he mentions that is kind of one of my favorite takeaways is that the idea, one of the main ideas behind motion layout is to have seekable transitions. So rather than having these transitions that you kind of just start and forget about, you have transitions that you can go to any point in the middle of that transition. You can instantly go to any kind of intermediary point between the start and end state, and you can have more control. And more than just seekable is that we can that instead of just kind of again firing forgetting, we can tie transitions to user interaction. And on top of all that, on top of control, we have a declarative, easier to read, easier to maintain, and easier to implement kind of structure for doing this animation. So I did all this talking. Let's actually see what all this is about. So talk, 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 talk. So I want to show you this example. So I have this is actually two layouts that I'm just doing the transition. As soon as I navigate to the activity, I kind of have a post delayed callback that just switches from one constraint set to the other. Let me see if I can actually open up that activity, and that's where it is, right? So I'm using kind of the tools that we had before, constraint set, to swap between these two things, and it's fine. Again, I don't have a lot of control over this. I'm using post delayed. I'm hoping that it goes off, and then I have no control over it starting, it stopping, or any intermediary states. So I kind of want to build on this and show you how step by step motion layout can make some of these things easier and nicer and kind of more under your control. So one thing that is not, it's not bad, but it's not great about this is that, again, I kind of have this like separation between two layouts that are written in XML, and then the actual code that transitions between them is in this case, Kotlin is in code, right? So there's this disconnect. It's not like all of my transition behavior is nicely in one place or the other. It's in two places. So one of the benefits of motion layout is that it starts to kind of move layout and transitions kind of back to where we kind of back into the kind of the XML declarative world. So there are new resources that you get with motion layout. So they're XML resources. So they live in this XML asset file. And this new resource is called a motion scene. So motion scene is basically a declaration of a relationship, of a transition. And it basically allows you to say, hey, I have a start state. Hey, I have an end state. And here is how I want to get from one to the other. And that's all a motion scene is. So it's XML. And the motion layout is able to interpret this and then do all of the work of the transition and kind of hooking up these transitions to user interaction. So this is a really simple one. So I have my two layouts that I had before. Okay, these are the two layouts that this transitions from when I do that constraint set swap. But rather than me doing the work in code of create a constraint set, cloning this layout file, and then applying it to a constraint layout that I've pulled the reference from somewhere else, I can write this XML file and I can declaratively say, hey, I want to transition from this layout set or layout set of constraints to this set of constraint. My constraint set start and my constraint set end. And furthermore, rather than just having it kind of fire off at some random point from a post delayed callback, I can actually say, hey, I want this transition to happen as I swipe. So I can trigger this transition on an on swipe and I can say, hey, how about on my Android, I want to listen to a drag that starts at the, it's kind of aligned to the top edge of my Android. And I want that transition to basically follow that swipe, that swiping. So I'll show you what it looks like in just a second. But what's really neat is that I have this declaration, right? I have this description of how my layout should transition. And if I go to motion layout, so first I actually have to change this to the motion layout tag. Okay. So now I've changed it to the actual motion layout subclass. And then what I do is that there's this new apply motion scene. Okay. And then what I do is I will give it the name of a scene. Actually, hold on. Get the names of the attributes. I'm going to okay. I'm going to go to this branch just to make it easy because I don't have to type as much. I never remember the names of these. There we go. It's layer description. So, rather than me doing this in code, I'm going to say, hey, motion layout, here is a file that tells you how to behave. And then I pass it this XML resource, which is this resource here. And I'm actually going to have to turn off this. Okay, it's already turned off. And then what I do is if I run that, and back to my emulator, the motion layout. All right. So number one, it's not transitioning immediately because I took out the post delayed. But what's happening now is if I actually swipe down and drag this Android, you can see that the transition is actually following the swipe. So motion layout is doing the work of mapping each like point in this transition to the swipe. And again, I didn't have to do an animator. I didn't have to do gesture. Like I didn't have to override any gesture listeners. I just specified XML and that's it. And that's kind of like the power of this declarative way of doing it. And what's really neat is that, again, like you kind of package together the layout and the transition, like how you move between one transition and the other. But you're not just kind of limited to just doing this. Because I think one thing that also is like less ideal about having these separate layouts is that the layout could be like 80% the same. And I want to say change the size or change like the margin. But I still like, using constraint set, I still might have to like basically copy paste like the whole file over again. And that's kind of annoying, and it's less extensible, less maintainable, right? Because there's just a lot more that you could type wrong. It's just not efficient. So what you can do, instead of just providing different layouts, you can actually describe changes in the motion scene. So rather than having a layout as my start state and end state, I can actually define constraint sets inside of my motion scene that will allow me to transition, to specify, okay, what exactly is changing. So for now, I'm moving clouds and my Android here. My Android's kind of dropping down from the clouds down to earth. I'm going to go ahead and just transition my Android for now, just so we can focus on how this works. So a lot of this looks kind of similar, right? I got my on-step, my transition, but rather than having a layout, I have these two constraint sets here that are my start and end state. And I specify just the layout params that I want for my Android icon at the start, and I specify the layout params that I want for it at the end, and that's it. If I go back to my motion layout activity, I change the layout description to be my other scene. So this one. So rather than using that kind of layout references, I'm just going to describe everything in the file. I'm going to go ahead and run it. Probably should have used instant run, so it's a little bit faster, but that's okay. And then if I go back, you can see that, again, because I was just moving the Android, you can just see that just the Android is moving. But again, rather than having to have two separate layout files that are mostly the same, I can just specify deltas. And again, that just is just giving you more power to say very explicitly, what are you doing, and making it more maintainable, more readable. And I just love that about this, is that instead of just, again, coding and trying to like do things so explicitly and so, I guess, imperatively, we're saying, hey, at a high level, this is what's changing. It just feels like a much friendlier and much more straightforward way of doing these kind of animations. So just to kind of fill things out, I'm going to fill in the rest of my clouds so that we can go ahead and see what that looks like. But yeah, I'll make my clouds move again. So everything is linked to these. Let me see. And live coding is fun. Let me try that again. Maybe Instagram was just a little bit fussy. Start motion layout and okay, one more time. So there's a lot that you can do with this though. Okay, it's not just for kind of moving between one end state and the other. And it's not just about layout params. There's a lot that you can do with motion layout that is really just fascinating. And I think that was one thing that was hard about constraint set, is that changing from one constraint set to the other only picked up really layout params. Anything that was basically layout underscore something. That's the only thing that constraint set was able to choose. So if you say change text color or change like a drawable, it wouldn't pick that up. And that's kind of difficult, right? Because when we're transitioning, it's not just position and size that are changing. Often it's like, opacity and other things that we want to use to make like a delightful experience. So on top of this kind of associating again and tying together user input with transitions, we actually get kind of this idea of custom attributes that we're not just relegated to layouts. We can change a little bit more of the kind of visual and styling aspects of layouts. So let's say that rather than just like my Android changing position, I want to change its color. So what I can do is actually add something called a custom attribute. So this idea is just basically giving you kind of more freedom to specify something that changes, that is going to be interpolated from a start state to an end state. So let's say I want to change the tinting. So I'm going to specify an attribute name. Now the attribute name has to be an attribute that can be set using this like syntax. So it has to has a setter. So you can turn any property on a view that is a setter into a custom attribute. So in this case, there's like a set color filter function. And so that's basically what I'm using to generate this attribute name. So set color filter, so the name becomes color filter. And what I can do is set a custom color value. And this is going to be the start value of my color. And I'm actually going to pull this out. So what's interesting is that the parameter type has to match. So color filter actually takes a color value, not a color drawable resource. So this is why I'm putting in hex. Let's start out with gray so we can end with a nice colorful Android. So this is my custom attribute. So basically I'm saying, okay, in the start constraint set, my Android has these layout constraints, but it also should have this color at the start state. And then what I can do is if I go down to my end state and I'll say, okay, now at the end of the transition, I want instead for my Android to have this color. So again, all we're doing is just defining start and end states and then hoping that MotionLayout can do the magic for us. So if I run that, MotionLayout. Now, hopefully this looks pretty good because my Android's now green. It was or gray. It was green before or black before. But as you can see, as I move the Android, it's interpolating from that gray to green. And again, you could totally do this without MotionLayout, but it would take property animators and all this kind of stuff and a lot of stuff in like Kotlin or Java code. But here,
I remember myself having done that.
Yeah, right. Like,
And it's
yeah,
painful.
yeah, the RGB, like, yeah. But here, I just start a set a start and start state, end state, and it does it for me. And I mean, I love property and value animators. I'm never going to stop using them. I don't think until they take them away. But just imagine how much easier this is for you to read, and how now you're actually associating a aspect of the transition with the rest of the transition information, right? You're not having these kind of disparate parts of your transition living in different parts of your code. And I just think that's totally valuable. And there's a lot that you can do with custom attributes. Again, if there's a setter for it, you can make a custom attribute for it. You are limited though, like again, that the parameter type. So say like here, say asset attribute. So whatever this parameter is matters. And there's only like a small set of custom values that you can set. So here you can see these are kind of like the possible types that the setter can take. So like color drawable value, like dimensions, some integers, strings. But there's a lot you can do with that. It is limited for, probably for feasibility reasons, but there's a lot you can do. So apart from this, so it's become really easy to kind of interpolate. But again, like we kind of talked about, it's nice when we don't just kind of start a transition and like, set it and forget it. We'd rather have more control. Um, and I think something that's really interesting is being able to really fine tune how things move. So again, my previous example, I mentioned, well, like this is nice, but the text kind of runs over. I don't have a lot of control. Everything kind of just is very like linearly kind of like, moving. Is there anything I can do to kind of tweak this to really kind of, I don't know, do something different with it? And the answer is yes. So if you were like a Flash person, like I was back in the day, or if you've done After Effects or any kind of like animation or movies, you probably are familiar with what keyframes are. So keyframes are also a concept in MotionLayout. So basically, think of this transition and think of kind of intermediary points along this transition. So what MotionLayout lets you do is to think about transitions in these pieces, and that's using keyframe. So keyframe is some point along this transition where you want to specifically state what you want the state to be. So rather than this kind of like linearly interpolating, I can say, hey, at like halfway through, I want this property to have this value. So I think the most easiest way is to just kind of show you how to do it. So basically, MotionLayout will take a transition, divide it up into 100 pieces, and allow you to set specific values, specific properties at any of those, like kind of like 100 stopping points. So you do this by specifying a keyframe set. And in this place, let's start simple. So right now, when my clouds are they're kind of boring. They just move in linearly, like shortest path kind of thing. Let's see if we can kind of make them dance a little bit. So there's a couple different ways you can specify keyframes, and a couple different ways you can kind of, I guess the word is perturb or kind of alter, like the deltas along each of those points. So you can alter the position. So right now, MotionLayout is drawing a path from the start and end state, and then just moving the icons along that path. I can actually use key positions to basically alter the path of that. So there's a straight line going from like the start and end, and I can actually kind of make the cloud have, kind of move a little bit off of that kind of straight line shortest path. And I use that using a key position. So a key position you define by saying a target. So whatever view you want to position. And in this case, let's say that I want to do cloud. Let's do the second cloud. Okay, so that's the view that I'm going to be kind of messing with. Right. And then the thing is like with when you're kind of specifying position for things, it's always going to matter like what coordinate system you're using or like how you're basically what's your frame of reference for defining a position. And for key positions, there's 3 different ones. I don't ever really remember the difference between the 3. I have to kind of muddle around and figure it out. The easiest one for me to understand is parent relative. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the cloud how much off of its path to move as some percentage of the distance across the parent. So this is say 0 and this is like 100%. And I'll say, hey, like at this point, I want you to be 50% across the parent. That's basically what parent relative is. And there's again other like frames of reference that you can use. And again, I'm going to say, okay, at whatever point this is, I want you to be all the way across the parent. So at a position 100% across the parent. And then I actually have to say what time this happens at, which is my actual frame position. So right, there's a lot going on there. So basically, I've just told the MotionLayout that I want this cloud at 20 frames in, at 20% in, or however you want to think of it, 20% into the transition. I want it to actually be at this point in the parent. And what MotionLayout will do, it's like it'll say, okay, you start here, you end here. You want the cloud to be over here at frame 20. I'll take care of the rest. And so what else we can do is, let me see. What else can we do? So we can also, where's that path? Let me just do this first. So we've set a keyframe, and MotionLayout's going to do all of the work. And maybe a little hard to see, but as you can see, whoop, you can see that now instead of just going straight in and out, my cloud's kind of meeting that frame position and going um, uh, kind of again hitting that kind of middle waypoint. And then that's just basically a way that you can kind of take that transition to the next level. You can kind of change things. And if you feel like, something is not as aesthetically pleasing or you want to kind of add more interest or make them more delightful, that's just another tool that you have to do that. So let's see. Now that's keyframe position. There's also key attributes. So you're not just relegated to using like positions. You can actually use attributes where I can set like middle kind of intermediary states for the actual like other attributes like opacity. Let's do color. So how about I take my Android icon, and let's say that because I love Android so much, I'm going to turn my little Android red. Let's say like halfway through, so at frame 50, so 50 out of 100, so halfway through. I'm going to say that, again, using custom attribute, that the color filter, which is the tinting on the image view, is going to be red. Okay. All right. So again, I'm just letting the MotionLayout know that for my icon, my Android icon, I want halfway through the transition for the color filter, the color tinting to be this value of red. That's it. All right. So I run this on instant run. Let's bring my emulator back up. And as you can see, without any work from me, it actually is red halfway through the transition. And then the start and end state are the same. I mean, this is kind of a silly example, but again, just the declarative, easy to read, easy to like experiment with ability, the ability this provides you for doing all these like really delightful things. Well, this is not that delightful. It's kind of silly, but giving you this power to really control how transitions look is just so amazing to me. And I think that, again, it's this idea of keeping information, keeping the things that you want this transition to be in the same file and being able to kind of very easily change and access and read it is just so valuable. So let's see, what else can we do? So you're not just relegated to swipe. You can also do on click. So because again, we very often want to transition things on click. It's just pretty easy. So what you can do is like in your transition tag, you can add another trigger for on click. You specify the thing that you want to click to do something, and you have a couple quick actions. You can toggle the transition between the start and end state. You can jump to the end, jump to the start. You can actually run the transition from start to end. We're just going to toggle it here. And without having to write any, quick listeners or anything like that, I can go ahead, run this again. And okay, then I can also just click that cloud. And now I'm able to transition between the two. And if I want to do something like say transition to end, it needs to run first. There's just other behaviors. If you want kind of like a reset button, you can do that. So if I was here and I wanted to reset transition, I can. Again, if I click it again, it's already at the start, so it won't do anything. But there's just so many like different things that you can do with this. Okay, so there's also like, some other like really cute little it's not just like attributes. There's a lot of other kind of really nice tools that you can use. You can specify custom interpolators. If you can actually stagger like kind of like how the different kind of pieces animate as well. Let's see, what else do we have here? There's also, let's see. Oh, something that's really interesting to me is there's this view called image filter, and I'm just gonna actually go ahead and just pull up the branch. Let's see. Out. 13. Don't reset hard like I do. Just usually don't do that normally, but I have everything saved, so it's fine. So what's really interesting is that there's some actual extra widgets inside of like kind of Constraint Layout 2.0 that allow you to do some really cool things. So there's a really interesting view called Image Filter View. So it is an image view, and what's really cool is that it actually allows you to crossfade between two different images. And with Image Filter View, you're going to get this extra attribute called alt source. So you define like a primary source like you normally would with an image view, and then you provide this alt source. And then what you can do inside of your motion scene is use this attribute. So there's a crossfade attribute on the image filter view, and that's basically going to be a kind of point between a transition from the first image to your alternate image. And it's probably easier just to see what it is. So in my start state, I'm going to start the crossfade at float value 2. And at my end state, I'm going to go ahead and set it to float value 1, so more or less like 0 to 100%. And if I actually run that, all right, and bring this up. All right, so instead of my Android, I have this kind of random clip art that I got from Unsplash. And so I have two image sources here. And since I set this custom attribute and have a start and an end point for it in the transition, as I pull this down, you can see it starts crossfading between these two states. So as you can see, without me doing anything, with just using this image filter view, I can get this really neat image filter, this kind of crossfade effect. And also what I have here, and I'm trying to find there's just so many new attributes. I just can never remember. There you go. Hold on. I think it's back in here. So there's actually a way to debug this. So earlier when I was kind of messing with the path, it's kind of hard to see, but you can actually on MotionLayout set show path true. And of course, don't do this for production, but it'll actually show you the path that your views will take in the transition. It'll actually show you like the entire path that the MotionLayout will take each widget through, and it actually shows you key points or keyframes as well, rather. So this light pink square is actually a keyframe. So if you're kind of doing a lot of fancy stuff and you feel like you're losing track, you can always turn show path on true, and you can always see kind of what your views are doing, and it kind of helps you like little tweak and kind of debug some things. Let's see. So I mentioned that Nicolas said that in a sense that they're trying to make seekable transitions. And it's not just that, you can, that you're just confined to working within this motion scene. You can actually start listening to and responding to the transition as well. So there's quite a few features that work with this, but very simply, if I wanted to say, let's see, let me go to motion layout activity. All right, let's say Okay, let me go back to the layout. All right, let's say I did something really silly. Let's say I add an actual seek bar. Okay, let's say that I wanted to take Nicola literally and have a seek bar be able to move like my, from one state to the other in my layout. I can actually do that. So I'm going to add a seek bar, and I'm going to hook up that seek bar inside of my activity. And what's really neat is that the motion layout, because it's aware of the transition, or it's kind of centered around transition, it actually has a progress property. So when you define a transition for the motion layout and it kind of starts entering into that transition, it keeps track of the progress. So I can do something like this where I have a seek bar, and every time the user moves that seek bar, I can listen for that progress change on the seek bar and then set that progress on my motion layout. And the motion layout will understand, oh, hey, you want this point in the transition, or you want this point in the transition. So yeah, I think the seek bar progress comes in as 1 to 100 in integers, whereas the progress on the motion layout is floats. That's what's going on here. But if I go ahead and run this, you can see that I can actually seek through my transition. And basically, again, and that's again leveraging the fact that the motion layout is aware of the progress of the seek bar. And there's there you can go the other way as well. So I think something that I've heard a lot of people ask them for is the ability to kind of respond to different events within the transition, like maybe having something fire off something else, or once the transition is done, you want to do something. So there's actually a transition listener class that is on Motion Layout. So Motion Layout has a transition listener. It's an interface. And so what you can do is something like this. Why don't you like that? Unresolved. Oh, gotcha. Because this is, so it's only on motion layout. So I have to change this to make sure I'm only motion layout. Okay, so transition listener. So basically, whenever the motion layout is executing a transition, you're going to get these callbacks. So when it starts, when a certain trigger happens, when it changes, when it's complete. And what's really neat about this is that, your transitions will have different start and end IDs. So if I go back to my motion scene file, you can actually get back the start and end state IDs, resource IDs, in these callbacks, which is pretty neat. But here, I'm just going to be kind of silly. I'm going to use my seek bar again. And rather than having the seek bar move the transition, I'm going to have the transition move the seek bar and kind of just reverse the idea of setting the progress on them. And I don't know when you'd actually want to do this, but again, it's the idea that it's not just kind of setting and forgetting, but that rather than the seek bar moving the transition can move other elements. So you can respond to the transition. You could listen for when a certain transition starts and do something. There's also, in kind of the latest version of Motion Layout, I think Alpha 3 has got released in December. There's this thing called key triggers, which is basically that it's a special keyframe that can fire callbacks. And I haven't played around with this too much successfully, but if you go to Chris Baines's, I think his Project TV, let me see. Right. So if you want a really good example of this, check out Chris Baines's TV project. He actually has been using motion layout to kind of re-implement coordinator layout and other things like that. But he uses these new key triggers, and basically on a certain frame position, you can call a method on that particular view that you have the keyframe on. But yeah, I mean, just it's crazy. It's just using this like this XML, these like declarative things, accessing things in the views, and again, being able to very describe in one place succinctly through XML and not like splitting things between code and XML. How do you want things to transition? And like I would just encourage people to use this. And I think what's going to be really interesting to see is like how this helps us build more delightful UIs. Like I know that at least for us, animation is kind of a challenge, right? I think motion design is still something that I don't know if we have like, if I know like for us, motion and animation is something that we drive as developers rather than it's something that the designers drive. And I think that's just more like because material design and this concept of motion design are relatively new. We don't have, I think people don't know what we're capable of, and traditionally animation's been pretty difficult. But you can start to see kind of how these tools, how these declarative ways of describing animations can help you work with your designers, work with your product people, and be able to, talk at a high level. What do you want these things to do, and to be able to kind of do them easily, like and maintainably and readably. So I encourage you to try it. It's still alpha, so of course, I wouldn't go ripping out views and replacing with motion layout. If it works, just stay with it. But if you have something new, if you want to play around with it, I really highly encourage you to do it. I'm sure Nicola has been asked this all the time, like, is it ready? And of course he'll say yes. But I've used it myself, and I think it's really great, and I think it's definitely a way to go. And if you've listened to them talk, there's actually a motion editor. I think they're working on a motion editor, which is kind of like a After Effectsy, more kind of timeline. Like they're going to provide us like with a GUI. I'm not sure if there's images of it.
That
They keep
that one
showing.
was really cool. Yeah,
Yeah, but
it's
basically,
like
yeah. Oh wait, here is that. Yeah, so something like this. So this is what our future might look like, where we have a timeline, and we can start kind of, really visualizing how animations work rather than setting animators and hoping. And I'm just really enthusiastic. I think this is gonna be just a new way to have conversations and explore and talk about how we do these delightful things. And hopefully it gets us to a better place, easier place, a more maintainable place. But anyway, that's motion layout. I really think people should try it. It's one of my new favorite things. And again, you just see how ridiculously easy it is to do cool things. So I encourage people to definitely give it a go. But yeah, thank you so much. Um,
it was really cool. Yeah, the kind of things you can do with a few lines of XML. It's incredible. Yeah. And I definitely have been in those places with barriers. For instance, I've used Constraint Layout 1.1 and I miss them a lot.
mhm.
And yeah, this keeps improving and improving, and I'm sure that it will be probably the preferred thing for many things in the future. So
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it's important that if you like this, or if you experiment and you find problems or you have suggestions, you should definitely reach out to John and Nicola on Twitter, on Reddit, on whatever, wherever you can find them, because they're very open and they want to know what are the real use cases? What are you finding tricky? What do you need? Like they're really open. And obviously they want to fix bugs. So uh I think that's part of it as well, is just take advantage of it. They're very nice gentlemen. You should take advantage of them, and I mean that in a nice way, but you should. Um, Also, like,
yeah,
they gave this really great talk at the Android Dev Summit. I mean, because now we have Motion Layout and the kind of other, systems, it's not like we're throwing the other ones away, but if you kind
of
of want
course.
an overview, right, of everything, Get Animated at the Android Dev Summit was a great talk, and I think if you're kind of confused about where to start or whether you really need it, or, like, what's the excuse for you to try Motion Layout, you should definitely watch their talk from Android Dev Summit.
Nice, awesome. Thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting and showed all the news we have from Constraint Layout. Sorry, I always mix those two.
It's gosh, so
and,
easy.
and regarding the questions, I we only have one from the audience, the
Okay.
live audience.
Mhm.
In fact, is from a person I think you know because you interviewed him,
Oh, really?
Nate Nate Eagle.
Oh, hey, Nate.
Yeah, that he asked something about a topic we talked during the interview,
Mhm.
and he was asking if we have any thoughts or suggestions on networking for those that live in areas without local developer community.
That's a really good question. I mean, for me, I think Slack. I feel like Slack has just there's been an explosion of really good Slack communities. And I think, yeah, like I know that there's like also like so there's like, for example, the Kotlin Lang Slack is really great. If you are a Kotlin type person,
Yeah.
as I know, like Antonio and I both are. Um, and I think that that's like remote tools like this. It's kind of hard because you have to discover these communities, but yeah, to make up for the fact if you don't have a local community, you need to find them out digitally, which is can be a little bit more difficult. It is always easier to connect people, I think, in person. Maybe not. Maybe your miles might vary, but there are like electronic communities that you can reach out and kind of start building connections. So there's like I know there's like Spanish language, Portuguese language, Android communities as well on Slack. There's the Kotlin Lang
Yeah.
Slack. There's kind of women-based ones as well. Like if you're like, I've ever heard of like women tech makers, for example. Also, like I know people think Reddit is a scary place, but our Android dev is actually moderated by some really amazing people in the community, probably many of them you've heard of. And that's also a place to kind of hop into conversations and get talking to people. So those are my suggestions. And don't be scared. I know Reddit's a scary place, but the mods work really hard to make the Android dev subreddit not scary.
Yeah, I agree with. If you don't have a physical place to go, it's a little bit more difficult to engage with people, but there are only other ways. And for instance, as Huyen mentioned, the Kotlin one is very active, and we, for instance, have one for Spanish people that is really active too, and people there also can talk about many topics and connect with each other. So it's really helpful too, and also social networks. The thing is that Android developers are usually very open, so it's very easy to connect with anyone through any social networks, and that can also help. Maybe not for networking, because that's a little bit more difficult, but to clear out any questions or answer any of your possible doubts that you may have. It's also really helpful. But yeah, I agree that it's much more difficult if you cannot go to a physical place, because networking works better if you are face to face. But
Yeah, I mean that's just it's kind of like the remote challenge, right? As we become all
mhm.
more remote or to more or less degrees, is how do we make these connections and maintain them? And it's not perfect. It's not, it's not as good, but I think with things like Slack and social media and things like that, it is easier. It does take more work, but it's not impossible. And like Antonio was saying, I think Android is I'm obviously quite biased, but I think Android is like a really amazing community, and we do have, like as you said, many open. Like I think many of us are very open and friendly and just eager to help you along and welcome you as well. So
Nice. And we have one last question from Gabriel.
okay.
He asks if you use any kind of snippets for Android Studio. I don't. Yeah.
I do. I do. I love live templates, which is what I was using. I was using them heavily for my Prezzo here, but I love live templates. I think I try to balance it, like, especially like, there's already so many live templates that are good for kind of things that we do every day, kind of that same old stuff. Well, I have to use these less now, but when we were, if you're in fragment world and you have all this boilerplate, it's very flexible to be able to kind of do really nice templatized live templates and kind of cut down on work there. Also, again, I don't have live templates for all of the new attributes in Motion Layout because I tend to forget things a lot. But I do use them like quite heavily. I find that it in general, once I get them down, it helps me with like, small errors and things like that. And obviously for places where we still have boilerplate and or Kotlin can't help us squeeze things down, it helps a lot. So yeah, I love live templates. It takes a little bit to, I guess, do really cute ones, fancy ones. I think there's actually a talk at Chicago Roboto last year about trying to leverage live templates. I apologize. I don't remember the name of it, but yeah, I use snippets all the time, even just for silly things like comment headers and things I just don't want to keep writing over and over again. Just I'm lazy. So I spent a couple minutes of making the live template. Um, but yeah, I think actually I also have, like, if you're on Mac, there's also this tool called Alfred, which is like it's like a launcher, a integrated search and all kinds of stuff. It also has snippets. I think I've used that for other snippets, like I don't know, like for code snippets. I tend to use like Unicode a lot for different things, or ASCII art sometimes. If I have like certain things I use my code all the time, so I'll put them in the the kind of like other snippet kind of managers. It's silly, but I like it. So yeah. Um, laziness is another of many good programming inventions and
Yeah,
tips. So yeah.
that's true. Okay, so I think we end here. We don't have any more questions, and so thank you again so much for dedicating this time to us. I'm really glad to have you here in the second program, and that's it. If anyone wants to connect with you, how can they do it?
Yeah, I fairly active on Twitter. My handle is at Queen Code Monkey. I apologize, it's really long. I've had it since uni. Can't really change it now. Um, or you can also go to my website, which is randomlytyping.com, and of course stop by Chuki and my channel, which is youtube.com/. Android Dialogs. Dialogs like the UI component, not like the actual proper English word. But yeah, Android Dialogs. So, but thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.
I I'm a big fan of you, Antonio, so I was really honored to be here, and thank you so much for doing this as well. I know it's a lot. Obviously, I know it's a lot of work doing things like this, so I really appreciate it. So, thank you
Thank
for
you so
having me.
much. I'm a fan of you too, so
Yay!
the feeling goes in both ways.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, and keep in contact. And for the ones that want to continue receiving notifications about these interviews, I can spoil that Nate Evil, in fact, will be in February, probably at the second half of February, and I keep the other one for February hidden for now. But you can go to Droidkast.LIVE and join there, and I'll email you when there are new interviews scheduled. So here you can find it. Again, thank you so much, and see you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye bye.